Good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you watch this. I am Jacob. I'm the pastor at Redeemer Community Church in Carbondale, and it is Monday afternoon for me when I'm recording this video. Yesterday we had some technical issues that made it so that we weren't able to, we put out a live stream video, it just didn't have any audio with it. And so because of that, I am making this video because lots of folks were actually out sick yesterday and wanted to be able to watch the sermon. And so we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, which is where we've actually been now for several weeks. Funny enough, as we've been working our way through Matthew's gospel in 2026, I initially planned that we would do 1 week in Matthew chapter 5. I thought I would be able to do the whole chapter in 1 week. Today is going to be the third, or yesterday was the third Sunday in Matthew 5, and there's going to be 2 more Sundays yet. So it went from a 1 week thing to a 5 week thing, but that's just kind of the nature of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew is curating a lot of teachings of Jesus. He gives us more of the direct teachings of Jesus than any of the other gospel writers, and he puts them in this kind of big conglomeration, and it's a lot. And so I was telling the congregation yesterday that some people have said, you know, well, I'm having a hard time with this, or a lot of what's being taught is going over my head. And to that I say, join the club. I have really had a challenging time working through so far in Matthew's gospel as well. But let's go ahead and let's read Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. 27 through 32. This is Jesus talking. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So, nothing big or heavy in that, right? Just, 2 of the most complicated issues in our lives, lust and divorce. I had an experience a few weeks ago in our services at Gateway on Monday mornings where one of the younger guys that we've had came up to me and seemed very nervous, and he said, hey, can I ask you a personal question? And I said, sure. You may not get an answer, but you can ask. And he said, do you know anything about lust? And I said, nope, never heard of it, never had it, don't know anything about it, don't know anything on that topic. And of course I smiled and quickly said, yes, but it warrants a one-on-one longer conversation than we can have just standing here. And so it's interesting to me, just so shortly after having had that encounter, that we come to Jesus picking up this topic. And he is essentially doing the same thing here that he did when he was talking about anger and murder last week. Jesus is going to shift away from this kind of just don't cross the line, just don't break the rule attitude that was common among the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Jesus' day. And Jesus is going to say, instead, let's focus in on the heart of the matter so that we get at these problems at their roots, rather than waiting until they are already a burning, out of control, raging fire. And so Jesus says, you've heard it said that you're not supposed to commit adultery. But I'm telling you that the reality is that anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery in his heart. And I think we can safely assume that the reverse is true, that if a woman looks at a man with lustful intent, she has already committed adultery in her heart. And so Jesus says we're going to move away from this just, you can think what you want, you can fantasize, whatever goes on up here, that's your business, just don't cross the line. And Jesus says we're going to switch to a how you view other people really matters. Jesus is getting at the fact that there is a vast gulf between lust and love. There are times in our culture when we sort of act like it's really hard to know the difference, but I think it's actually pretty stark, the difference. Love is about giving. Love is about serving. Lust, on the other hand, is about taking and consuming. So love is going to be oriented towards the good of the other, being, selfless. Lust is very selfish and is going to be about taking from someone else. Love treats a man or woman as a fellow image bearer of God, someone that is worthy of respect, worthy of honor. It seeks that other person's good. Lust is very different. There's really no overlap between lust and love, because lust says, I want to take this. I want to have this other person that isn't mine. I want to consume them, or I want to have ownership over them. And it's very, very selfish. It's very much about what would make the sinner feel good, as opposed to what's actually for good for both sides of the equation, actually. And I think it's interesting because the way that Jesus shifts the conversation gets us away from just this is only about a husband cheating on his wife or wife cheating on her husband, and he actually gets us to this place of adultery is any engagement that we have with another person where we're trying to have something sexually that's not rightly ours. And so this goes beyond just a married man cheating on his wife or a married woman cheating on her husband, and it gets into a single person who is seeking out a sexual relationship with another single person, because that's not the way that this works. Sex belongs within marriage, within Christianity. Love would call for commitment and selfless giving, and would see sex as a good thing that has a specific purpose in a specific place. It also deals with the issue of pornography. Consuming pornography fits into Jesus' definition because Jesus says looking with lust is adultery, because it is feeding into an appetite and kind of ginning up an appetite for something that's not ours to have. And so again, we're seeing, just like we did last week with anger, Jesus is not this easygoing guy who waters things down and makes things easier. Jesus is actually holding his followers to a much higher standard. He is encouraging us to think about these issues as dealing with whole people, not just certain parts of our body, but that our mind is involved, our heart is involved. And, as much as maybe this seems like something that's unique to Jesus, I don't think that he's actually breaking new ground from the Old Testament, in the sense that the Old Testament has a lot of wisdom about this. Places like Proverbs 23:7 says, as a person thinks in their heart, so they are. And so there's an awareness that it's not just about, skirting around the edges of the rules, but that the way that we think, the things that we entertain in our minds, actually matter, because what happens internally has a way of working itself out if we keep feeding it and we keep harboring it. And so Jesus is clear. We don't have the right to think sexually, to fantasize sexually about anybody who's not our spouse. And Jesus knows that this is a hard teaching. But I think it's rooted in a bigger principle that I don't remember being taught growing up in the church, which is that there is a right response to beauty and a wrong response to beauty. Nobody ever that I remember told me as a young Christian that when we see beauty, whether it's another person, a beautiful woman, a beautiful man, that we need to engage there just as if we see, a beautiful piece of art, we see a beautiful piece of architecture, whatever. We need to engage with beauty in a healthy way. We need to see it as something that God created, acknowledge that there's beauty there, and ask God to help us to relate to beauty in a healthy way. So ideally, when we see beauty that God has created, engaging it in a healthy way would be engaging it in a way that honors the ultimate source of beauty, that honors the Creator, that ultimately honors God's beauty, that would see something beautiful as a gift and not engage it in a selfish way as something that we need to control, something that we need to consume, something that we need to conquer or have for ourselves. When we see beauty, there is a natural appreciation that's built into us for it, and that's a very healthy thing. Seeing beauty isn't something that we need to feel guilty about. It's just a matter of, are we engaging that beauty in a healthy way? And the healthy way is to see all beauty as a reflection of God's divine beauty. And so, as I've engaged with this, I'm not an expert on it by any means, because again, it's really something that I've only been thinking about for the last couple of years, but I think we can intentionally pray, asking God to help us, that our hearts would be trained to respond to beauty in an upward way, not a downward way. So upward in the sense that it would direct us towards an appreciation of God, of God's good creation, as opposed to putting us downward, where we're sort of twisting around in envy and a desire to consume and a desire to control and a desire to have beauty all to ourselves. Beauty is meant to draw our hearts upwards in praise and worship, to help us to live in anticipation of greater beauty and glory. And so this even comes into play in the relationship between a husband and a wife. Husbands and wives should not engage with one another in a lustful way, but should engage one another in a way that is healthy in its reaction to beauty. A husband ought to relate to his wife in such a way as to appreciate her beauty, to be attracted. But I feel like there's something in even Christian circles these days that almost says, well, a Christian man should relate to his wife with this, like, well, I have to have that. That's mine. Like almost like lust is okay as long as it's within marriage. And I don't think that's true. I think this applies to married people and single people, that there is a healthy way to relate to beauty and an unhealthy way to relate to beauty. And a lot of this for me came through reading a book. The name of it escapes me at the moment. It's probably right over there on my bookshelf if I were to go over there and get it. But it helped me to begin to see that beauty should draw us to God. Beauty should draw us towards God. And that we as Christians want to engage with beauty in a holistic way, whether it's a beautiful person, a beautiful sight that we see out in nature, a beautiful piece of art, whatever it is that's beautiful, that we appreciate its beauty, not that we pretend that we don't see beauty, and that we understand that this cultural idea that we can think whatever we want, whatever goes on in our heads is nobody's business, and we have, sort of the right to think whatever we want to think. For the Christian, that's not true. Jesus disagrees with the idea that how we think is only our business, because Jesus says the way that we think, the way that we engage internally, is going to lead to real change in the way that we interact with other people. And so what happens on the inside doesn't stay just on the inside in the case of lust. And so when Jesus is talking about poke your eye out if it causes you to sin, cut your arm off if it makes you to sin, he's not talking literally. He's not telling people to poke their eyes out or cut their arms off. He's making a point that says lust needs to be dealt with. And I think it applies to more than just lust. I think it applies to any sin, greed, fury. They are all like disease in the body. They need to be excised. They need to be cut out. They need to be surgically dealt with before they spread to the rest of you, before they spread to your whole body, before it infects other aspects of who you are, before it infects other people. The way that we think about and engage other people, certainly including people of the opposite sex, really matters. Because if we set out and we recognize that they are brothers and sisters in Christ and that we want to pursue their good and that they belong to the Lord, they don't belong to us, and that beauty ultimately points us towards God and is a gift from Him, that's going to naturally set us in a healthier direction than this, kind of bad momentum of feeding into selfish ideas of consumption and lust and a desire for control and a desire for ownership. It comes up in the addiction ministry work that we do as a church that, some people are very into talking about addiction as disease, and some people, some Christians have a real problem with that. They think that by talking about addiction as disease that we're giving people, we're not holding people accountable. But I actually think that's exactly what Jesus is doing, is he's engaging with the idea of sin as being like disease. When Jesus talks about cutting out your eye or cutting off your arm, he's talking about the way that you would deal with a part of your body that was infected. That's the way that up until, fairly recently, medically, if something was wrong, you cut it off. And in Jerusalem, in Judea, the way that they would do that is they would cut that off and they would take that contaminated, diseased, infected body part and they would throw it into Gehenna, which was on the was a burning sort of biohazard trash dump that sat outside of town. The spot is still there today. It's not a burning biohazard site today, but the Valley of Henna is still there. And so Jesus is saying it's better to have early detection, to deal with it when it's just in your eye, to deal with it when it's just in your arm, before it spreads, and throw that away, burn that away, deal with that infection, get rid of that infection, excise that infection, so that it doesn't spread. It's kind of the Jesus equivalent of the thing that we hear medically a lot today, which is early detection saves lives. Jesus is saying early detection, when it comes to sin, saves lives, saves hearts, saves souls. And so instead of letting ourselves and our sin nature just kind of go crazy and try to see, like, how close can we get to the boundary without breaking the boundary? How far can we get and let the fire burn? And hopefully, it doesn't burn everything up, but, just some. Jesus is saying, no, deal with these issues when they're a small flame, instead of focusing on how far can I let this go. And so that's how he addresses it with lust. And he's going to bring the same thing over into the other topic that we heard about in Matthew 5 in the reading, which is divorce. And divorce is a touchy topic in the church in 2026, because Christians actually don't have that much of a different track record when it comes to successful marriages that last, as opposed to the culture that's around us. And that's touchy because Jesus does talk about divorce specifically. And Jesus does not come in and do maybe what people would assume and sort of lower the standard for marriage and divorce, but he actually raises the bar higher. And the reason that he does that is that in the culture, as Jesus found it in the first century in Israel, God's people had gotten into some really bad habits. Moses had allowed for divorce in the Old Testament in the case of indecency. That's the English word. And so I think we could probably come up with a pretty clear sense of what he meant by indecency, right? Similar to what Jesus says, sexual immorality. But over time, as God's people engage with the law and engage with God's commands, instead of, kind of driving right into the middle of them and accepting them as good and a gift that they want to get as close to the heart to as possible, God's people start looking for cutouts so that they can do what they want to do anyway. And so people are, in the time of Jesus, using indecency to mean a lot of things that I don't think Moses, ever meant for it to mean. And so people were saying, well, my wife doesn't cook good. Her cooking is indecent. And so I'm divorcing her. That was happening. Husbands were saying, my wife looked this way when I married her, and then now she is unattractive, and that's indecent. And so I need a divorce contract written up to leave her behind. And this is a real problem to Jesus, because marriage in the scriptures is intended to be the sacramental picture of God's relationship, God's covenant with his people. Marriage is intended to help us to understand, to be able to see right in front of us some picture of the way that God relates to his people, to his church, called in the scriptures his bride. And so what's happening is God's people have started coming up with excuses for easy divorce. It's become let's use God's law, let's use the carve out that Moses gave to us to allow people to abandon their families, to abandon their wives, which is creating all kinds of unhealthy societal dynamics, breaking up families and leaving women to fend for themselves and children to struggle, it creates a lot of societal upheaval, but it also paints a really unhealthy picture of what's supposed to be a picture of the relationship between God and his church, God and his people. And so Jesus does what he's been doing with all the previous topics, and he says, stop thinking about how you can get out of your marriage. Stop engaging with marriage in such a way that you're looking for a way out, and start looking at what it means to be faithful. Start looking at marriage, understanding that love costs something. For Christ, as the husband of his bride, the church, his love cost him something. And so over and over again in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to call us to the harder way. He's going to call his disciples, his followers, to do things in a harder way, not the easier way. He's going to call us to not bail on each other. He's going to call us to try to find ways to make things work, to stay together. And here's the fact of the matter. We could get off into the weeds, and I've seen a lot of pastors and preachers do this, get off into, and maybe I shouldn't even call them weeds, into the specifics of, look, here are all the ways that divorce happens that it shouldn't happen. And we could do that. We could have that conversation. But my sense is that even within a congregation, one single congregation like ours, we're going to have different understandings about what this looks like to live out Jesus' command. But here's what I think is really clear, and that's whatever it looks like to live out Jesus' command faithfully, it's not what we're doing. Whatever faithfulness, whatever a serious commitment to staying together and trying harder and loving unconditionally and working to make marriage work as a sacramental union, it's not what we've been doing up to this point. And, look, I think Jesus engages this in a really healthy way, and he says, let's not take it from Moses, okay? Moses allowed for you to divorce in the cases of indecency. Jesus essentially endorses the same thing. In the case of sexual immorality, that is a breaking of the marriage bond. When that happens, the relationship has already been ended. That is, in a sense, that is divorce. It is a cutting off. Jesus says, let's go back to the garden. If we want to know about marriage, we go back to the very beginning and what was the intent of marriage. Marriage was for the benefit of the husband, the wife, the children that would be produced in this relationship, because it's not good for someone to be alone. And so, again, we could get into discussion about a lot of different specifics, but what's clear, I think, is Jesus is saying Christians should have a different attitude towards marriage and divorce than the world. And I don't think that it's about being legalistic. I don't think it's about trying to shame anybody. I think it's about Jesus is the creator. All things were created by him and through him, and he wants healthy marriages because he wants the flourishing of humans, and he wants to see marriages be what they were originally intended to be in the beginning, which is foundational for humans, for families, and a picture of our relationship with God. And so we as Christians want to be people who fight hard for our families. Now, that's where we had to stop yesterday in the service. So we've got a couple more weeks working through Matthew chapter 5. We're going to be looking at, not lying, talking about retaliation, talking about loving our enemies and responding in love to our enemies. And so, if you were able to sort of sit through today's teaching and say like, well, I felt pretty unscathed by that. I don't know very many people who at some point in their life don't deal with lust or issues within marriage. But if you felt that way, come back next week and the following week, because somewhere in this, Jesus is going to step on your toes. I think he's an equal opportunity offender. We all get our toes stepped on by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And where the rubber really meets the road is how to respond to this. And of course, it's a little bit different doing it in this setting than doing it on Sunday morning, where I can call people and invite them to the front to come up and to celebrate communion together, to come up and have prayer with me. And so doing it in a video is a little bit different, but I want to say a couple of things. Jesus acknowledges a real issue around lust. And it is a profound problem for men and women. We live in a time where, because of social media and easy access to pornography, there are a lot of aspects of our culture that encourage people to lust. I mean, you can literally not be seeking out the opportunity to do wrong, and it will come seeking you out. And so Jesus tells us to deal with lust like we would deal with a disease, like we would deal with a cancer, to cut it out before it spreads. And so I would encourage you, consider prayerfully where you might need to be at work on this issue, where you might need to have some early detection, where you might need accountability. And the church can help with that. In our church family, there are people who have accountability software programs that they're held accountable for what they do online to other people in the church family. We believe in having, hard conversations about sexual sin and relationships. And even me, I have maintained accountability software, have an accountability partner outside of the church that helps me. And so there's no shame in really thinking seriously about how to be planning for health, spiritual health in the area of lust. And as it relates to divorce, there's a lot of walking wounded with divorce. There's a lot of people that are going around carrying pain. There are people, I think, that know that they didn't give their best, that they participated in the ending of a marriage where they didn't give their all, they didn't give their best, they didn't fight hard enough. And I want you to know there's forgiveness for that. You don't have to continue dragging that baggage around with you. You can ask God for forgiveness. You can confess to him and say, you wanted better for me. You wanted better for us. You wanted better for our family. You wanted better for all the people involved. And I fell short of that. And I need your mercy. And you can ask God to begin to heal you and to heal all the others that were affected by that broken marriage. And we as a church want to help people to fight for their marriages. And so if you're in a spot where you've been thinking about divorce, where it comes up a lot, there are resources. This church has stepped in over the years and helped people with marriage counseling, with going away and doing hard things to try to save marriages, because we want to invest in helping. We want to see marriages redeemed rather than folks giving up on them. So those are some real world ways that you can work through responding to these two areas that Jesus teaches us about. And I'll encourage you to check back in next week when we move on to talking about truth telling and lying and loving our enemies.